we think first about the sort of the generational, multicultural, global demographic changes that are happening in the world, I'll ask you for a little bit, and this maybe drift off to sleep after lunch, but imagine that we're 50 years ago, it's 1964, the Beatles just landed in San Francisco after about 6 months after the Ed Sullivan Show, and I am a visitor from the future, right? So we're all in black and white, and I'm going to tell you some things about my world and the world ahead of me that would surprise you in 1964. And interestingly, if you landed at San Francisco Airport, there's an exit with the Cow Palace on there. I tried to snap a picture but missed. So we'll go back 50 years, and I'm going to tell you that the population will more than double in 50 years, and we'll be approaching 8 billion people, but that the population rate is slowing. And a couple dozen years from where you are, there's going to be this new thing called the internet, the World Wide Web, and it's going to connect every person on the planet. And you'll be surprised to imagine that 87% of American adults use this, 99% of households, high-income households connect to this thing, and virtually everybody, young adults, college degrees, and that there'll be these new devices called mobile phones, like your desktop phone or your wall phone, but people will carry them in their pocket, and they'll connect to this network. It's going to be really cool, trust me. So in this thing, not only are we going to have humans connected, but we'll start to get into this Internet of Things, where your fridge may be connected to the internet, and it will take an inventory of the things inside and send you a message on your mobile device to pick up milk at the grocery store. It's really going to happen. And a few years from where I come from, 5 or 6 years from where I am, right now there's 12 billion things connected to this network, and that will more than quadruple in just the next 5 years. So the other thing that people will do on these mobile devices is watch a lot of video. So what you see on TV today, you'll now be able to see on your phone or on these things called tablets. And there's this service called YouTube where people can upload free video and watch videos for free, and that will see a 40% increase in mobile traffic in 2014 where I'm from. So the world is going to change a lot, and what's interesting is it's not changing, the changes that are coming are global, and that the BRIC countries and South Korea and Indonesia, BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. 50% of the growth coming in the 10 years from where I come from is going to come from these countries. So it's truly going to be a global experience. So then when we think about, well, wow, this is a lot of change that's coming, what's that mean? Well, games, and why we're all here today, and you can start to make your journey back to 2014. In China, huge, 1.6 gamers in China for every American citizen. And 28% of them, of the 517 million who play, it's about 150 million people play for more than an hour a day. And so when we think about these global changes that are coming, where can we find some commonality? And that commonality is in games, game mechanics. So if we shrunk this global village down to 100 people, 61 would be from Asia, 80% would have these mobile devices, 80 of the people, and 70 of them would be gamers. So what we've been looking at Microsoft and thinking about, these high percentages, okay, 99, 98% of 17-year-olds play games every day. That is the new incoming workforce, right? And so the next generation that enters the workforce is very technologically savvy, they're handy, but the games, regardless of the country that they come from, games are a common element. And I can sit down with someone, and I may not even speak their language, but I can play a game of chess. So as a cultural bridge, games make for a fascinating activity. So now we shift into, okay, this is great, we have a lot of gamers. Well, what do we do? And I can't believe that I'm not the first person to have the word predictive analytics on the slide. So this big data thing that's coming, and I'm sure everybody's heard of it, but there's just a few examples of where this is being used. This is this is a giant sand table with data projected on it for wildfire simulation. And so they move the sand around where they would dig ditches to irrigate and try and put out fires, and they could start simulated fires. But it's all driven by big data, all driven by field data that they get on the air temperatures and telemetry on the forest growth and all that, and it's simulated into this table they can use for fire training. It's used in game design. It's probably hard to see, but this is a racing game. And if you can see the red there, that's where people are crashing. So they know that they can tune the game, either tune the speed of the cars or the shape of the curve based on player patterns and how players generate. So I'm sorry, I'm going to watch my time. I haven't done this. I'm either going to finish in 5 minutes or 45 minutes, so somewhere in there. But using games for testing, right? So now so I'm in Skype, and I'm sure people are familiar. It's an audio-video calling application, but it's connected to the cloud, to servers up in the sky. And so being able to use big data to tell us where we can improve things, where we can make things easier, where we can fix things. We can set up a side-by-side experiment, have some people do one thing and some people do another, and use data to compare the results. And then in marketing and advertising and loyalty programs, a lot of the things you've heard today based on data. And so I'll go through a little bit of our experience in some of the games that we've run. And I think there's maybe a couple slides in here that capture a lot of our learning. This is one of them. And I'll just kind of walk through briefly where we've been able to use games in the workplace successfully and also where we've failed miserably. So first, thinking about the 3 columns, we have on the left the core work skills, which are skills that everybody has, the ability to type, to speak a language, to make a phone call. Then the unique work skills are the things that I'm paid for myself to do as part of my job. And then expanding skills, which are things that I can learn and be better at my job after I do that. And then the two rows are the in-role behaviors, which are behaviors that I do every day as part of my job. And the second row is organizational citizenship behaviors, which are OCBs, which are things that I can do to make the organization a better place, but are not necessarily part of my job. So things like help a neighbor with a problem, or share my work with somebody, or clean the coffee pot after work. Things that make the world a better place, make the organization a better place, but are voluntary on my aspect. And so for us in testing Skype, there's a lot of value to us if we can get a marketing person or human resources or legal, someone who's not in the engineering team, to install a pre-release version of the software and use the product and give us feedback. They are much closer to usage patterns to their customers than someone who's been working on the product in engineering for years. The problem is, how do you entice people to do this? And this is where we've had a lot of success in games, and also a lot where we've learned a lot. So I'll talk through a couple lessons. So obviously the green check marks are where games work well. So the upper right is expanding. That's games for training, games for education, very low risk. And then these core skills for citizenship behaviors, and I'll walk through a couple examples, have been very effective. And I'll talk specifically the upper center column, or the upper box in the center column, is where I think a lot of the, if you hear some of the risks around gamification or some of the negative aspects, I think fall in that box. And I'll just take a quick survey. Who would like to earn the Do More Work badge? Oh, there's one. That's where a lot of people deploy games, right? They say, oh, we'll gamify this, but what they're doing is actually, the example I use is, okay, we roll out the Do Ross's Job game, and all of a sudden I come in 10th at my own job. I'm feeling a little awkward with the conversation with my manager, right? And similarly, if I come in first, does that mean I get a promotion, or does that mean I get to keep my job? I'm not sure, because I already have rewards and levels and all these things I'm already showing up for, that now this new thing comes along, and I don't know how to compare and the exchange rate between these two. Should I do my job for my paycheck and the things that I've always done, or should I adhere to this new point system? And so that's where we tend to see a lot of misuse of game mechanics. And we've learned that. We had one game where we're trying to crowdsource effort like this, and we put out a game, and one player jumped out to like a 400-point lead in the first day, and everyone else had 3. And so everybody stopped playing. And really what we're trying to do is to get everybody to play, right? Because it's fun, mandatory fun. And when you intersect with traditional reward systems without realizing that, by just rolling out the Do More Work badge, people get very alienated and have a negative affiliation with the game, and so the experiment tends not to work. but then these OCBs, where you're doing, you're playing the game voluntarily. There's a Dutch philosopher, Johan Huizenga, who talks about the magic circle of play, which is a place that you enter voluntarily, which is a key aspect of this. And it's fun because there's a different structure that's not reality. So if you think about a soccer or European football field, it's just a field. But then when you go on there in a structured setting with rules and gameplay mechanics, people have a lot more fun than if you just walk on and you don't adhere to that alternate structure. And so an important thing for games in the workplace is they have to be voluntary. And so if you overlay them with somebody's job, that's not voluntary. And so it doesn't make it fun, and it doesn't make it more productive, and people tend to have a negative reaction. So I'll walk through a couple specific examples. And this is, Link is the sort of enterprise equivalent of Skype. And here's just 4 simple examples that we use to test mobile, which is very difficult because part of the, Phaedra mentioned earlier in her talk, the return on investment is critical in games in the enterprise to really understand, have a specific objective, and really understand the behaviors you're trying to drive and the investment that you're making so that you make sure it's a positive one. And so for mobile games, it's very difficult and expensive to build a specific game application to test a mobile application. So what we did was we leveraged sort of existing, oops, I guess I got them all here, sort of existing functionality of the product and just built a social game around it. So we used a sort of group meeting session to build a story. And basically so people are sending IMs and having conversations with each other and then giving feedback on the product. We had to display a landmark and picture of a landmark in a meeting, and the first person to reply to guess the landmark got some points. But basically we just scaled these up to get, similarly with identifying road signs, and then we had a mobile fest where people could come and basically drop off their devices. We could analyze logs and get feedback. But the benefit was that the people playing were from outside of the organization. So it was not part of their job. It was just, hey, come if you want to have fun. It's a voluntary thing. Come and help us and play a simple game. So the game development was not much. We had, depending on the game, between 20 and 50 players maybe, but enough to get diverse coverage, which is a benefit for our test efforts, but not an expensive development process. So our probably most famous game is the Windows language quality game, which we did in Windows Vista. And it was a very simple browser-based game where we crowdsourced effort, activity around linguistic quality from native language speakers across Microsoft. And the process, the game ran for 1 month. It was voluntary, and so people from all over the world could play. Basically, we hooked into our engineering process and grabbed screenshots of the localized dialogues, little animation. They flew into the browser, and you probably can't see, but there's little colored pens up in the right. You could highlight areas that were wrong and drag it to a looks good or something's wrong bucket and get a point, all right? And that was it. And so the interesting thing, we had 4,500 people play and over 500,000 screens reviewed. And so it was a tremendous boost to the linguistic quality of Windows. And I think the top player reviewed 9,000 screens, but again, it was a voluntary activity. I'm not sure, I haven't met that person. I'm not sure why they were so willing to volunteer. I'm not sure that their boss would have appreciated that much effort, but we sure did. And the interesting thing is, from a citizenship behavior perspective, a lot of the local subsidiaries in other countries who normally would either not be able to do this because they'd have to install a pre-release version of the operating system, or they would have, once they did that, they would have to kind of dig through and look at every dialogue and give feedback. It was very difficult. So we lowered the bar for them to give us feedback. And a lot of the subsidiaries just took a day and just, hey, everyone, if you want to go play, take your time and play. And so we saw a lot of effort, and it was really in that citizenship, hey, let's help out the Windows team. I speak the language, it's a core skill, so that really in that lower left box, and that's really what we use to rationalize all the games we do. So this one, Communicate Hope, we did to test the Link product. and it was themed around disaster relief. And so we worked with 5 NGOs, and players could come in and sign up to represent a disaster relief agency, and then they essentially helped us test the product and give us feedback. And then at the end of again, we ran for about 1 month. We donated a lot of money to the charities, apportioned on the points that the different players had earned. And so it was a great way, and the idea of playing altruistically really got a lot of people who were not normally gamers to participate because they were doing good to help disaster relief. And we had a really good A/B scenario in this one, in that we had a very similar size program just the year before, essentially the same audience, and what we saw was a 16 times increase in the amount of feedback that people gave and the engagement. And again, it's tremendously valuable if we can get people outside the engineering team giving us this feedback, because it's a lot closer to the customers. Another interesting stat is that of the people that signed up for a team, 67% of those gave us feedback versus 3% who did not. And so it does work. And one of the things we've learned is, as Phaedra hinted on earlier, not everyone is a huge fan of games in the enterprise. Some of the quotes, games are gimmicky, we don't play here, we work. So we've been very rigorous with data collection, so we can go with an A/B experiment and say, see, in this case they do. And so I think a suggestion I would give to anybody who's doing this in an enterprise, to really be sure that you measure everything you can, because if you run into naysayers, being able to come back with the actual data is pretty powerful. So going into, or sort of going back to data science and thinking about, okay, how can we use games in this new big data world? How can we use games to help us? And so Eric Raymond in the Cathedral Bazaar, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Some of you may have heard that before, but basically the more people we can get looking at things, and the more diverse set of people we can get looking at things, the more we can improve. And as everything is connected or becoming connected to the cloud, and it's that whole internet thing I was talking about before, that data is available and accessible, and so you can really use it to refine the experience. So couple quick, this is just a real world example of, you can see this is sign-in performance in a small group, and you can see the outliers who had a poor experience. And now having this data and being able to drill in and see what are network configurations, what do machines look like, having that data is tremendously helpful. But the problem we have, and so to try to describe this, so we have this authentic data that real users are generating, right? But they're generating it in areas where they're doing their work, right? And there may be other areas where there might be new features, or we may feel like we're in need of some more experimentation or different configurations that we don't understand, where we need more precise or more volumes of data. So looking at the tools and techniques we have here, so if we look at this, the upper left, this high volume or highly precise data that's not very authentic. There's this concept called synthetic transactions, which are, if I use the world of Skype, it's a little automated thing that makes a phone call to make sure the service is still working. And if the service stops working, hopefully that transaction tells us before the user would find it, right? And so these run all the time, usually on the server, and monitor to make sure things are still working. And then you have in the lower right the authentic transactions, the things that real people are doing, right? Making phone calls, making video calls. And then we can do in the lower left these A/B tests. We can set up comparative tests between things, but they don't necessarily represent the actual customer. And we don't get, if it's not A or not B, it's somewhere in between, we don't get the precision and the volume that we need. And so this concept introduced into the concept of gamified transactions, which are transactions done by real users, but in the context of a game. So to the software, it looks like a real user behavior, but the motivation behind the user performing that action is gamified. They're doing it in the context of a game. So if you think about, okay, I want to make a group video call with 8 people, that might be not something that enough people normally do, and so in the context of a game, we could add gameplay mechanics to encourage people to make calls with with 7 other people. And so that idea of using games to drive user behavior to round out the data, the big data that we need to improve the product. And so walking through some of the things we can do with these different types of sort of techniques. And I'll kind of skim through this kind of quickly. But the authentic transactions we can monitor. We have tools that monitor. So if users have experience, there's feedback, and there's inferential and predictive analytics we can get from actual user behavior. And then these synthetic transactions can detect outages, determine call quality, things like that. Frame drop, audio frame drop, and then more interestingly, these gamified transactions, we use the game mechanics to direct crowd activity. We have to design them. We can design gameplay such that we don't impact the service, and we can learn a lot about gameplay mechanics and really generate precise A/B studies to know exactly how users are behaving. We can use gamified transactions to get coverage and direct users to areas that may be difficult or expensive to configure. We can understand who early adopters are, both in gameplay and in traditional product use, and compare those two. To do this, using the games to gather better demographics about your users and where they go and where they don't go, and then really measuring, are we creating, with the games, are we creating what's known as sort of the observer effect? Are we affecting the use of the product through the game, right? And in some cases, that's what we want to do. In some cases, that might taint our data and give us information that's going to be incorrect in terms of actually using or directing the product. Another area we're looking into is crowd reputation, and the value of the feedback we get is only going to be as good as the accuracy or the precision of the data itself. And so it's possible for people to give incorrect data back or spoof and all that. So really this idea of understanding user reputation both through activity and use of the product as well as through gameplay and game mechanics gives us the ability to separate out what feedback we should pay attention to. So a good example of this is in the language quality game. We injected known goods and known failures, and we could use that to determine how accurate. So if I'm a native German speaker and I jump into the Chinese game to play just for fun, my data is probably not going to be that accurate. And so how do you measure the reputation of your user, of your game player, such that you can know what data to filter out? And the idea of this sort of feedback quality, one of the things we've learned is that prizes don't really help, that a good game design is going to be much better. The prize generates unnatural behavior in many cases, and we, in several cases, giving away mountain bikes for no reason. The winner actually, who had the most data, didn't have the most useful data. And so really understanding from a data science perspective, how can you drive accuracy in the feedback, in the user feedback, and giving users a way to demonstrate their reputation, either explicitly or implicitly, is a great way to help slice your data so that you know you're acting on the right stuff. And so the opportunities that these gamified transactions bring to this cloud-based world is, imagine if you have hundreds of thousands of people using your service in the context of a game. So they're coming in voluntarily. They're a great source for monitoring how the service is doing. You can scale up, scale down. You probably, if you design your game mechanics the right way, they're going to respond immediately if they see an issue. And you can use this crowd to help tune and optimize the experience for your real users. This is sort of an interim set of people who are there doing the same thing that real users are doing. They may be real users, but they're doing it because they're motivated by the game mechanics you're using. So this will give you feedback on the scenarios in your product. Do they meet the needs? Performance testing is a good one, and just sort of in general crowdsource testing, using a crowd that's a little more friendly because they're playing in the context of a game.